Hello and good evening from quarantine. It's a beautiful evening out, and so I thought this would be a nice opportunity to begin with the first of two installments about the COVID-19 crisis. This first one will be kind of some generally applicable things which are worthwhile to do all the time, but especially in this time of crisis. And in the next installment, I'll talk a little bit more specifically about my take on the disease itself and risk management and then where I think we should go from here. So, let's get started. I would say that the most important thing that we should do in a crisis like this one is the same as the most important thing we should do all the time, which is to love God and love people. That's a good summary for all of life. Now, I've recently seen significant criticism of people who prioritize their relationship with God. And with all due respect, you critics are going to die soon, just like the rest of us. There's no amount of worrying about this life or antagonism about God that's going to prevent you from dying. And if I'm wrong, then it's meaningless. The time that I waste worshiping God is meaningless, and so is your criticism of that. It doesn't matter. But if God exists and we're actually eternal beings, then COVID-19 is actually the least of your problems. You are distracted. It pales in significance compared to missing this opportunity to know God and receive life. Now, that doesn't mean that I think it's wise to cram lots of Christians into small buildings or anything like that. But it does mean that our relationship with God really is more important than this virus. Now, with respect to loving people, there's two things I want to focus on, and these are generally applicable, but they're all the more important during this crisis. Now, it appears that with respect to these two things, most people are doing, or many people, I guess, I would say, are doing quite poorly on the first, and really, really well on the second. So the first part, which I think needs improvement, is that loving others includes not violating their rights. Human rights don't come from government. They are essential to being human. They're the same for all people everywhere, held by all individual, living, distinct human beings, and exercised or stewarded, in some cases, by competent adults. God created the world this way. He did not generally permit us to violate the stewardship of other people's rights. Now, whether you believe in God or not, respect for human rights is not optional. It's mandatory for everybody, for individuals, groups of people, and for governments. It's wrong for governments to violate people's rights. Now, it should go without saying that this ideal, this view of rights is regularly violated, and all the more so now. I want to highlight, emphasize, foot stomper, a crisis is not a valid excuse to violate people's rights. Now, viruses aren't human, so they don't have human rights. We're free to extinguish them as we see fit. Unfortunately, we have not learned how to do that yet. But human action is rightly prohibited or restrained when it is reasonably certain to violate the rights of somebody else. For example, if I were to take something without the permission of its owner or pull the trigger of a loaded gun pointed at another innocent person, those actions are likely to violate those people's property or life, respectively, and so they're prohibited. I may not do those things. But do we have rights with respect to viruses or contagious diseases? And I think we do. I accept that placing someone else in a position of extraordinary risk, far greater than what we normally incur on a day-to-day basis, without their informed consent, violates their rights. I think that's a reasonable view of human rights. A person who knows they're contagious with a disease and exposes other people without their informed consent violates their bodily rights, in much the same way that a drunk driver violates the property and bodily rights of others. Those risks are not ordinary, they're extraordinary, and any person, including police or government, may rightly stop those behaviors. Enforcing an isolation or quarantine for a person who is known to be contagious is kind of the functional equivalent of taking the car keys from a drunk person. They would otherwise be free to do as they see fit, but the extraordinary risk they pose violates the rights of others, which allows for that kind of defensive intervention. Now, it's worth pointing out that the minimum amount of force necessary is what should be used to protect yourself or someone else in a limited case such as this. By contrast, forcing everyone to isolate without knowing if they're contagious or drunk or going to drive or be around other people is not a defense of human rights. It's a violation of human rights. We should never violate human rights. We should be even more careful not to do that in a crisis. And it appears to me that we are failing, particularly governments are failing miserably on this component of loving people. Now, the second part of loving people that I'd like to highlight is compassion, and that includes things like kindness and generosity and self-sacrifice for the benefit of others. Now, it's mandatory to refrain from violating other people's rights, but compassion is not similarly mandatory. It's not defensible by force. And for a more detailed discussion as to why that is, you could Google negative rights and do a little reading, and hopefully you'll see why I say compassion is not morally enforceable. Nevertheless, it's a moral calling, and we are right to do it ourselves and to teach others to do it voluntarily, using means such as advocacy or example, or even sometimes non-coercive discipline, things like separating ourselves from other people or natural consequences. In the second part of this, hopefully two-part series, I'll highlight some specific ways that we can be compassionate towards others by reducing the normal level of risk for others and ourselves. There are also many other opportunities for compassion for those who are harmed by either the shutdowns or the disease itself. For example, we might help those who are sick but need medical care or basic necessities or even just simple comfort. We should always be compassionate all the time, but we should be all the more compassionate in a crisis. And here, I think we're doing well. I've seen countless extraordinary examples of compassion, from essential professionals risking their health to serve others, to friends and neighbors and communities working together to help where help is needed. And these demonstrate great love for others. This crisis has brought to my attention amazing compassion from all over the world, and it's highly commendable. So thank you and great job for your compassionate love for others. Now, before I go, there's one more thing I want to leave you with, which I hope will be helpful. I'm not anxious or afraid about the virus or the government, both of which I think are harmful and even deadly. It appears many of you are worried about the crisis, both the virus and the economic effects of the entire world practically being shut down. It seems this virus pandemic comes along, buy one, get one free, with an anxiety pandemic. Now, my lack of worry or anxiety is not because I naively presume that I'm immune from illness or financial catastrophe. Rather, I depend on the very highest authority in times like these. The Apostle Paul wrote, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." Jesus himself said, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes?" As I pointed out earlier, I believe that there's more life than this simple, limited time, physical-only existence. Now, if your view of this life is that this is all there is, then I can understand COVID-19 would look very threatening, and that could cause anxiety. But Jesus tells us we ought not worry, that God provides for us and that he loves us. And this rings true to me. He didn't say that we wouldn't get sick and die. Rather, he said we should prioritize God, seek his kingdom first, and he meets our needs. we are better equipped to enjoy this life and only equipped to enjoy eternity when we put God first. Prioritizing God gives me peace now during these trials and encouragement to love others by respecting their rights and by being compassionate. I'm thankful that God has provided, and He's provided greatly for me, and I think for you as well. He will continue to do that. I pray for peace for myself and for all of you, and for relief from this trial, as God sees fit. But most importantly, more importantly, I pray you will come to a place as well of loving God and loving others. I hope you have a great Easter weekend. God bless.